You've probably seen photos of bombers in tight arrowhead formations, rows of heavy, lumbering aircraft flying in perfect harmony. But imagine for a second that a bomber crew had to fly backwards. Yes, backwards. And it wasn't just some stunt. It was the only way they could hit their target with deadly accuracy. Sound crazy? That's because it was. But it was also genius. This story begins in the early days of World War II, a time when the skies over Europe were a deadly battlefield. The U.S. Air Force was facing a problem they couldn't ignore. Bomber formations were vulnerable. The Luftwaffe, Nazi Germany's air force, was ruthless, and American bombers, which had been designed for daylight raids, were now being torn apart by enemy fighters. The solution, it seemed, would be to fly in tight formations to protect each other, something that had worked on paper. But in practice, it wasn't working. At the heart of this dilemma was a commander by the name of General Ira Eaker, a strategic mastermind, but also a man who had to learn, through devastating losses, that what worked in theory didn't always work in the chaos of war. Eaker's team had tried everything, more fighter escorts, tighter formations, but nothing was enough. And then one day, a test mission would change everything. On a sunny afternoon in 1943, a B-17 Flying Fortress took off from England, carrying a crew that had no idea they were about to stumble onto something that would revolutionize aerial combat. The target was a heavily defended factory in Nazi-occupied France, and the plan was simple: bomb it into oblivion. The problem? German fighters were waiting. But the solution came from an unlikely place. The pilot, a man named Colonel Joe L. Gurney, had an idea that seemed almost absurd. What if they could reverse the formation and have the bombers face backwards, with their tail guns leading the way? Could it work? Would it keep them out of the direct line of enemy fire? Gurney was about to put this theory to the test, but there was one thing he hadn't counted on: the psychological toll it would take on his crew. They were already stretched thin, but what was about to happen in the air that day would push them to their breaking point. Would they be able to hold their nerve? Could a backward formation really work? As the bombers climbed higher, the air was thick with tension. Little did they know, they were about to become part of a story that would defy every rule of military strategy they knew and change the course of the war. But would it work? Would they hit the target? Or would they just become another casualty of war, lost in the fog of failed tactics? Stay tuned. As the B-17s climbed higher, heading into enemy territory, the air was electric with nerves. Colonel Gurney's idea was a gamble, a move so bold it could either revolutionize aerial warfare or doom the entire mission. The thought of flying backwards was already unsettling, but the more Gurney thought about it, the more he realized this was their only shot. The bombers' tail guns were their best defense against the Nazi fighters lurking in the skies. So, with the enemy ahead and the target below, Gurney made the call. "Form up in the reverse position," he ordered, and just like that, the bombers began to turn. Instead of the familiar forward-facing formations they'd practiced for months, they now faced the rear of the plane, with the tail guns positioned toward the front, ready to take on any incoming fighters. The crews had trained for months to fly in tight formations, each bomber in lockstep with its neighbor. But now, with the planes flying backward, there was a deep sense of disorientation, a psychological weight on every airman in the squadron. It felt like we were heading straight into a trap, one of the gunners later recalled. You could see the enemy planes coming in from behind, but we weren't supposed to be facing them head on. It was like flying into the jaws of a beast, but not knowing if it was going to bite you. But there was something to this unconventional setup. By flying backwards, the bombers were effectively turning their weakest point, their vulnerable tails, into their strongest. The tail gunners, who were usually tasked with fending off attacks from behind, now found themselves in an offensive position, able to fire on approaching fighters before they could get in range. As they crossed into enemy airspace, the first signs of success began to show. The German fighters, used to taking down bombers from the front or the sides, were thrown off. They didn't know how to react to the backwards formation. It was disorienting for them too. Some of the German pilots made their moves, attempting to break the formation, but they found themselves taking fire from the very planes they thought they could destroy with ease. Yet, despite the initial success, something unexpected happened. A few bombers, nervous and struggling with the unfamiliar formation, began to falter. One B-17 lost its lead, veering slightly off course, and then another plane broke formation entirely, panicking as it tried to regain its footing. The gamble was working, but only for some. For others, the stress of the situation was too much. Colonel Gurney was left with a haunting question. Would this innovation be the key to victory, or would the chaos of flying backwards create an even greater risk? Could they actually hit the target under these extreme conditions? As the bombers neared their target, the answer would soon become clear. But there was one final obstacle ahead. Would they make it through the enemy fighters, or would this new strategy be the death of them all? Tension was unbearable. The real test was just around the corner. The enemy fighters were closing in fast. The sky above the target area was a swirl of chaos, filled with flak bursts from the ground and German aircraft darting in like vultures. The bombers, now flying backward in tight formations, were becoming the target of every fighter pilot in the region. But what happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. As the bombers began their run over the factory, Colonel Gurney's gamble seemed to pay off. The B-17s, positioned with their tail guns leading the charge, unleashed a deadly hail of fire that forced the Luftwaffe fighters into evasive maneuvers. The bomber gunners had perfect sight lines, able to strike the attacking planes before they even got close. For the first time in the war, the bombers were fighting back effectively, not just from a defensive position, but with offensive power. Then came the moment of truth, the release of the bombs. They fell, tumbling through the clouds and down toward the factory. The crews had trained for this, but there was always that nagging uncertainty. Would the formation hold together? Would the bombers be able to maintain their course, flying backwards as the target approached? The answer was stunning. Not only did the bombs hit their mark with astonishing precision, but the factory, one of the most critical German war production sites, was obliterated. The mission was a success, but the true surprise was the aftermath. The formation, despite the extreme stress of flying backwards, had held together with unprecedented cohesion. The bombers had proven something incredible. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had found a new way to survive and strike back with ruthless efficiency. But as the planes turned for home, a new challenge emerged. They hadn't just altered their tactics, they had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. Would this new formation become standard practice? Or was it a fluke, a one-time success in an otherwise chaotic war? And then, just as the bombers crossed back into friendly airspace, Colonel Gurney received a message that would seal the deal. You did it. You made history. But the real question remained. Could this new strategy be sustained in the long run? Could they keep flying backwards, risking even more lives? Or was this a temporary breakthrough in an unforgiving war? As the bombers touched down, the answer was clear. The backward formation wasn't just a tactic. It was a glimpse into the kind of innovative thinking that would shape the future of air combat. The crews who had taken part in the mission knew they'd pushed the boundaries, but they also knew one undeniable truth. This was just the beginning. Would this innovation be adopted across the entire Air Force? Or would it remain a footnote in history, a strange moment of brilliance in the middle of a brutal conflict? That question would linger in the air long after the last bomber had landed. In the days following the mission, the U.S. Air Force analyzed the results of the backwards formation with intense scrutiny. The initial success was undeniable, but the long-term viability of such a risky maneuver was still in question. While the crews had pulled it off in spectacular fashion, most agreed that it wasn't a strategy that could be relied on consistently. The psychological strain on the airmen, the difficulty of maintaining such precision, these were all factors that made the backwards formation more of a desperate measure than a permanent solution. Yet, the innovation didn't go unnoticed. It sparked a wave of thinking about bomber defense in ways that hadn't been explored before. The idea of adapting tactics on the fly in response to the horrors of war would be carried forward. It laid the groundwork for future technological advancements, like better defensive armament and fighter escorts, and even new bomber formations that balanced both offense and defense. What started as a last-ditch gamble had shown that courage under pressure and out-of-the-box thinking could defy expectations. It was a fleeting moment of brilliance in the midst of a brutal conflict, one that reminded everyone involved. Sometimes, the most audacious ideas are the ones that change history. And history, in this case, would never be the same.